Hello, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel. And today we're going to be drawing on lessons from global evidence to discuss what it will take to achieve gender equity in education by 2030. I'm guessing that many of you have participated in the Transforming Education Summit this past week, and we are really very excited and happy to continue this conversation with the panel today. My name is Selim Güleşçi. I'm a professor of economics at Trinity College Dublin, and I'm also a JPAL affiliate and scientific advisor to JPAL Africa for the portfolio on girls' education and empowerment. And in this portfolio, we are aiming to support governments to use evidence to design policies and programs for adolescent girls. And I will be moderating the panel today. And I'm very happy and excited to be joined by such a distinguished group of colleagues, including Professor Pascaline Dupas, who is a JPAL affiliate and professor of economics at Stanford University. Nicole Haberland, who is a senior associate at the Population Council, and both Nicole and Pascaline will be presenting to you shortly. We also have a wonderful group of panelists today, including Benta Abuya, who is an education specialist at African Population and Health Research Center. We have Marta Muwezi, the executive director of the Forum for African Women Educationalists. Megan Mahoney, who is the director of M&E from Educate. Shiraz Chakera, who is an education specialist at UNICEF. And last but not least, Susanna Harris, who is a senior fellow and co-director of education at the Center for Global Development. Welcome, everyone. And to begin with, we are going to start off with about 30 minutes of presentations on the state of evidence on girls' education. And then we're going to jump right into a discussion on how we can use what we have learned to advance the cause of gender parity in the next decade. Throughout the panel, please feel free to engage in the conversation. We'd love to hear from you. And for this, you can use the Q&A function in the Zoom. And at the end of the panel, we will try to synthesize and highlight some of the questions depending on the time we have left available. And whatever questions we cannot cover with this will be passed on to the panelists and will be part of the discussion through the Q&A. Okay, let's start. So let me first of all hand over the floor to Nicole from the Population Council for an overview of the state of the evidence. Nicole, please feel free to share your slides and take it away.
Great. Okay, are my slides showing? Let's see.
Yes, perfect. Yeah. We can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. And it's great to be here. Welcome. I'm going to share with you the results of a systematic review of gender-related barriers to education, and then dig a bit deeper into some of the questions that this review raises and some of the gaps. So a quick background. The good news, there's been dramatic increases in girls' enrollment. Gender parity has been achieved globally in primary and secondary enrollment. The not so good news, gender gaps in enrollment remain. Progress in attainment has stagnated. There's very low levels of learning, shocking, in fact. Girls face ongoing conflict between schooling and adult roles, and there have been extended learning disruptions due to epidemics, environmental disasters, and conflict. So despite remarkable gains in girls' education over the past decade, striking gender disparities persist, especially if we take an intersectional lens. The poorest girls have the lowest attainment, the worst learning outcomes, and the biggest gender gaps. So why is that? There are some barriers to schooling that usually, not always, but often affect girls and boys equally, such as poor pedagogy. But a number of barriers are gender related. Some of these, such as inadequate school access or inadequate food, affect both boys and girls, but the impact is often more pronounced for girls. And then there are other barriers, such as child marriage, inequitable gender norms, and early pregnancy that impact only girls or overwhelmingly girls. So we set out to find what works to address 18 hypothesized gender-related barriers. The final paper was published earlier this year, is available on Campbell's Systematic Reviews Open Access. In terms of methods, I'm going to go through this quickly in the interest of time. Also, it's boring and it gives me PTSD. So we did an extensive search. We included randomized trials and quasi-experimental designs that attempted to control for endogeneity. So these were causal studies. Analyses had to measure effects on girls' educational attainment, enrollment, or learning outcomes. And we were unable, unfortunately, to conduct meta-analyses due to a lack of comparable results across studies. So we used the GRADE approach to synthesize the data. So what did we find? We identified 26,000 papers. Screening of all the titles and abstracts led to 857 papers that went through full text review for a final set of 88 papers presenting 82 studies for the final systematic review. The countries represented came from all Global South regions, but most studies, and 36 of them, which is 44% of our sample, were conducted in just 4 countries. That was India, Kenya, Uganda, and Bangladesh. So given the importance of local context, especially given the diverse specifics of education systems and gender systems, this is a big gap in the evidence base. Most papers evaluated interventions that address more than one barrier. For example, a study might evaluate a program that combined school construction, financial incentives, and tutoring. But breaking down the studies per barrier, it ranged from 0 papers identified for school-related gender-based violence to 23 evaluations addressing inadequate school access. So remember, though, we're looking here exclusively at education outcomes for girls. So there may be studies that evaluate such interventions for other outcomes, such as health or violence, or there may be studies that looked at education outcomes but didn't disaggregate by gender, which happens much more than it should. So what did we find? We found that effective interventions exist to address 3 of the gender-related barriers: an inability to afford tuition and fees, lack of adequate food, and insufficient academic support. So with the exception of academic support, which shows consistent effects for learning, so literacy, numeracy, the economic and food barriers tended to show stronger effects on enrollment and attainment than on learning outcomes. We found that promising interventions exist to address 3 other gender-related barriers: inability to afford school materials, inadequate school access, and lack of water and sanitation. And for all these, we found, again, stronger effects on enrollment and attainment outcomes than on learning outcomes. For 8 of the barriers, we determined that more research was needed because there was just not enough directly relevant research to draw conclusions with high confidence. So these included barriers like child marriage and adolescent pregnancy, school-related gender-based violence, inadequate sports program, inadequate health and childcare services, and inadequate menstrual health management. And these mostly simply had too few evaluations that assessed the impact on education outcomes for girls. Also remember that there are probably evaluations that assess whether addressing these barriers affect other outcomes such as violence, health, or gender norms, and they may be affected at achieving those goals. It's just that we don't know yet whether or not they are effective interventions that impact girls' enrollment, attainment, or literacy and numeracy. Finally, we found that 4 barriers needed more research due to heterogeneous effects. For these barriers, there were interventions in some settings that were found to be successful with medium or large effect sizes, but in other settings, results were weak or the program had no impact. And this isn't surprising because these programs are all quite different under these categories: how well they're implemented, at what age, their content, the duration. Furthermore, the context in which they are implemented vary enormously as well. So who, when, and where may require very different program approaches to have a beneficial effect. For example, an intervention that shifted gender norms and led to marked increases in girls' school enrollment in the 1980s in rural India may not have the same impact if implemented today. Also, the issue of imprecision reduced confidence in the findings for some of these barriers. For example, life skills all were part of multi-component programs. So the 15 studies that evaluated interventions that included life skills also included components such as academic support, financial literacy, financial incentives, vocational training, etc. Unless the study is designed to isolate the effect of life skills, these other components may explain all or part of the impact on education outcomes. So we don't know for certain what, if any, of the impact is attributed to the life skills components. Now, all that said, I want to call attention to what's missing in this review and the implications of some of the gaps. So in addition to more and better studies, which we need, education outcomes aren't the only reason to address gender-related barriers to schooling. Literacy and numeracy are absolutely key, but there are other reasons: rights, dignity, equity, that matter. Also, even though we know some programs that work, we haven't nailed it, right? There's still a need to innovate, to learn, and to adapt. Eliminating some barriers, such as violence, is simply a right. We don't need an RCT to tell us whether safe schools improve education outcomes. Schools should be safe, period. And it's something as duty bearers that schools should ensure. So if that's something we agree on, then the research question is how schools can best do this. And we can learn from successful programs, for example, such as in Uganda by Raising Voices, and in India by Breakthrough, that have demonstrated important impact. Other interventions work to address some barriers sometimes. For example, we found that life skills education improves education outcomes some of the time. This isn't surprising, again, because the details of a program and how well the program is implemented can vary a lot and matter a lot. So the questions here are more about how these programs work, when, and for whom. And we can leverage implementation science to start answering questions about program length, dose, supervision, etc. What are the key components and characteristics? For life skills education, for example, there's strong evidence that learner-centered teaching approaches that foster critical thinking about gender and power are key. But what are the most effective duration and dosage combinations? Are there tipping points if we reach a certain percentage of our target population? And we can take a holistic perspective and consider the other important social emotional skills and mindsets, the 21st century skills and other multi-sectoral outcomes that these programs can contribute to. My colleague Sajida Amin has some fascinating results from a study in Bangladesh, the Balika study, that inform this. Other barriers, such as child marriage and early pregnancy, are closely linked with school leaving. The strong correlation may reflect intertwined decision-making processes by families, driven in part by lack of alternative pathways for girls. Both child marriage and adolescent childbearing may be driven by gender norms, by poverty, poor academic performance, and in the case of pregnancy, lack of access to contraception. So these are multi-sectoral problems requiring multi-sectoral solutions, which is challenging. But these girls are among the most vulnerable, and there are millions of them. So regardless of the reason or the sequence, girls who are married as children are young or are young mothers complete less schooling. So we either need to support these girls to get back into school or provide alternative ways for them to learn. Finally, one of the common threads underlying all these barriers is inequitable gender norms, roles, and behaviors. How do interventions to shift gender norms improve education outcomes? Are they necessary but not sufficient to reduce barriers? And we need to stop reinforcing gender inequity in school. This happens every day in ways large and small, through harassment, microaggressions, biases in textbooks, gender stereotype treatment and tracking, violence, and we need to start supporting education systems to be a force for equity and inclusion. So we know quite a lot, but we also have quite a lot to learn. Thank you so much, and back to you, Salim.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I mean, first of all, for conducting such an impressive study and for presenting to us and keeping perfect time. I think it was very valuable to learn both the evidence that we have, but also where we are lacking and we're in need of more evidence. So now I'm going to give the floor to Pascaline, who's going to tell us about a very long-term evaluation that they've conducted in Ghana. Pascaline, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Nicole, for this wonderful overview. I'm going to illustrate some of the points that you made with the results from a very long-term study that we conducted in Ghana with a number of collaborators and a huge team of enumerators from IPA Ghana. And in particular, I'm going to show some evidence consistent that the inability to afford school can be a huge barrier for girls in particular, that this seems to be caused by lack of support for girls' education, which is not really stemming from a lack of information about the returns to education. In fact, it's going to be a context where parents massively overestimate the returns to education. Nevertheless, they do not seem to be that keen on subsidizing girls' education. So this is a context. When we started, it was in 2008 in Ghana, where you have primary schools and junior high schools and senior high school. And at the time, it was pretty clear that you had some drop-off along the way. So about 95% of children who go to primary school was free. Then junior high school was down to 75%, despite it being free. And then there was this huge drop-off. And by the time you were in senior high school, it was only about 25%. Okay, and this huge difference between junior high school and senior high school was due to the fact that senior high school was not free. It was actually quite expensive, about 20% of per capita GDP, as per our estimates, for a year of schooling, and senior high school was 4 years. Okay, there was also threshold, an exam that you have to take at the end of junior high school to qualify into senior high school. So these two things combined led to this huge drop off in enrollment by the time you're in senior high school, and girls as of 8 were much less likely to enroll in senior high school. So we started a study in 2008 that examined the question of what would happen if school was actually free, holding admission criteria constant. So you still have to qualify and be placed into a school, but then you don't have to pay fees. Okay, so we did by identifying among a cohort of students who had passed the exam in 2008, been placed into secondary school in the fall 2008, but had not succeeded by the end of the first term. It was typically because of financial barriers. We identified, 2,000 of them. Roughly, this was the sample size we needed for our study. And then among them, we randomized whether or not they got a scholarship. So we held a lottery, and the winners, was 1/3 of our sample, won a scholarship, and we paid for their education for 4 years. And the lottery winners did not get a scholarship. They could obviously on their own and pay on their own. And we did this in Ghana, where the question of making secondary education free was very, very salient. It was at the core of the presidential election debates in 2008 and again 2012 and again 2016. And to get to the chase, in 2017, the of Ghana did pass free secondary education. Okay, but it took a while. And at the time in 2008 when we started, there were a lot of questions about whether this was the right thing to do. And even now that it's been in place for 5 years, there are still questions about whether it was the right thing to do and whether it should be kept. Okay, so I'm going to bring some evidence to the table about the impact that this had. Okay, the first thing is that the scholarships increase the likelihood that people were able to get to school. So this graph shows you for each term. This is the first term when we sampled school, and then call them up and say, you want a scholarship? If they were in a red group here, the treatment group, these are boys and these are girls. You see immediately, as soon as we call, we're going to pay for you to go to school. Most of them were able to go straight to school and enroll. Now in a control group, it's not zero, which is also the good news, which is that even if they were not able to enroll on their own immediately, over time they were able to convince, their parents, their uncle, the community to somehow get for them to go to school. So over time, up to 40% of the boys in the control group and 30% of the girls were able to go to school on their own. Okay, but ultimately we have a big gap in achievement in senior high school completion between those who got the scholarship and those who did not. And this gap is actually greater in percentage terms for women than for men. Okay, so among the control school men, 67% were able to complete senior high school on their own, so they managed to somehow get the cash. It was only 45% for the control group women. And the increase in percentage terms that the scholarship created was larger here for girls and for boys. So we created this huge gap in senior high school completion. And very interestingly to us, even though we only financed senior high school, we found that those who got the scholarship were actually more likely to be able to go on to tertiary if they were girls. So not for the boys, okay, but for the girls, even though we pay for tertiary at all, getting a scholarship for secondary opened doors for them and unlocked some new possibilities. And in particular, in the context of Ghana, some tertiary programs are subsidized. If you go to teacher college or to nurses college, you get a stipend. And so these talented girls who had not been to school by their parents, but thanks to the scholarship, were able to go, did well, and then avail themselves of these opportunities. So reducing the cost and bringing it close to zero for senior high school changed also tertiary education outcomes. Now, what does this mean for the debate on free secondary education? The proponents focus on the benefits of making it free, and the opponents focus on the cost. In particular, the concern with making education free for everyone is that you have a lot of what we call inframarginals. So what are the inframarginals? All the people who on their own can pay, okay? So if you make education free, you make it free for everybody, not just those who couldn't pay, who could have paid on their own, okay? And so this is obviously a very large price tag that's very, very salient, to policymakers. And so on the opposite side of this cost, you have the benefits. And so that's what our study was doing, which was quantify the benefits across domains, okay? And that's the point that Nicole mentioned, which is that education outcomes are not the only reason to address gender-related barriers. And illustrate that point very clearly, because in our studies, we looked at a wide range of outcomes, okay? So in particular, we look at two sets of results. We looked at impacts on the study participants themselves. So those who won the scholarship, we compare them to those who did not win the scholarship. And we look at the impacts on what they've learned, obviously, but also their fertility outcome, health behavior, and long outcomes. We did that through some extensive data. We did an in-person survey first in 2013, 5 years out. And then since then, we've been doing pretty much yearly phone surveys, including one in 2020 during the COVID crisis, and the most recent one in 2022. And we were successful at having very, very little attrition, thanks to a well-thought-through design ex ante to keep people in the study for as long as possible. But then we don't stop here. We actually have an kind of like a spin-off study, if you will, where we are looking at the impact of very children of this youth who got or did not get the scholarship. Okay, so this is kind of like second generation impact, if you will. And we're going to look at the health of these children and the cognitive development of these children. And here, the premise is that having a more educated parent may make as a child, having access to better resources and do better. And we're going to look at that specifically for the children of women who got on our. And so these are two separate papers. The first one, we've not yet with the 2022 results. So there's a link online, but stay tuned. We are going to update it soon. The second one is not yet out there, but very soon. Different sets of co-authors. And as I said before, a huge phenomenal team on the ground in Ghana. So let's look quickly. First generation results, which is the results on the cohort who got access to the scholarship. We find that they learn quite. So this is some standardized tests that we administered. We normalize it so that the control group gets 0, and then we see 0.16 standard deviation increase in knowledge overall. Now, these results, these gains are there for both women. Very, very striking is that the gender gap remains quite large. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if you look at the comparison group, you find that girls do way worse than boys. Okay, so girls were tested 5 years after having completed junior high school. They didn't get the scholarship. More than half of them were not in school at all. After that, there seems to be a lot of decay in what they had learned. And so by the time they are tested, they do very badly on the test compared to the boys who are more likely to still be in school, even if we didn't pay for them. And maybe have activities that require them to use their numeracy and literacy skills more. It's also likely the case they actually left junior high school, the girls were already at a disadvantage. Okay, so there's this very striking gender gap in performance, both within the control group and within the treatment group. So what I find most heartbreaking about this graph, even though we see huge treatment effects when we look at the girls, we find that the girls who got the scholarship are still performing worse on this test than the boys who did not get the scholarship. Okay, so empowering girls to go to school and subsidizing it for them increases how much they learn, but it still leaves a huge gap compared to the boys. So I just wanted to put that out there, and we can maybe discuss that more. Now, we also look at other learning impacts, not the skills, but also how much they know about local politics, things like that. We see a number of effects in different domains. Just as an example, I showed you here knowing how to use the internet. Okay, in these days and age is actually very important. You can see here again a huge gender gap, so women are less likely to know how to use the internet. But we see a treatment effect. Early on, the girls who got scholarship are much more likely to know how to use the internet than those in the control group. And then over time, the control group catches up. Okay. Now, I want to focus more on the education outcomes to tell you the extent to which getting access to education really transforms people's lives. So this is showing you impacts on the take-up of preventative health behaviors that was measured after 5 years in 2013. We asked them about hand washing with soap, bed net use of and we sum up across these behaviors, and we find that the treatment group is adopting this behavior to a larger extent than the control group, both men and women. Overall, the women are taking up these behaviors more. One of the key health behavior that we look at is reproductive health outcomes, and here we find a very substantial delay in the onset of childbearing. So this is a context data which is very different from the South Asia context that Nicole was mentioning. Girl marriage is an issue. Here, this is a little bit of the reverse. It's not like girls can get married and then have kids. It's more like, during teenage years, if they happen to get pregnant, then there's going to be a shotgun marriage. Okay, so pregnancy is kind of like what triggers the marriage. So if you avert pregnancy in this context, you can delay also marriage. And so what we see here is that initially for the first 4 years, only 10%, 14%, 20% of girls were getting pregnant. There was not much of a difference between the treatment and the control group. That is starting in 2013 when these girls turn 17, 18, 19, we start seeing a gap that opens up and that dies. So up to today, 2022, which is 14 years later, we find that is still the women who got a scholarship are less likely to have started bearing, and essentially they shifted the onset of their fertility. And then I'm not showing it on the graph for the sake of time, but we have similar results for marriage. Okay, so it's because they get pregnant later, they do get married later, and then they also end up having more positively selected partners, if you will. So we find that the girls who got a scholarship are more likely to, if they have a partner, to have a partner who got a tertiary education, for example. Now, on the labor, we find that for both men and women having gotten access to the scholarship, they are less likely to be self-employed. So this is showing you across the years, the effects, was strong at the beginning and then faded a little bit because some of the students went back to school to be in tertiary school and then back again. And so we see that having gotten this education, you're less likely to be self-employed. Where do you go? Well, you're more likely to be wage employed, okay, the converse, but the effect is especially strong for women, okay? So women on average are less likely to be wage employed than the men, but the gap between the treatment and the control, I don't know if you can see the numbers here, but in 2022, which is our last round of survey, as a couple of months ago, we find that 33% of women who got a scholarship were wage employed compared to 25% of those who did not get the scholarship. So it's a gap of almost 30%, and then it's just about a 10% gap here. Okay, and then in particular we find that women are much more likely to be in public sector employment. Okay, about 13% in the treatment group compared to only 7% in the control group. And here I just want to highlight one point that Nicole mentioned, the fact that we don't yet know enough about information about the returns to education. this is a context where at baseline, when we ask the students themselves and what do you think are the returns to going to secondary school, they were massively overestimating the returns because they were convinced that if they could get to senior high school, they would actually all get a government job. Okay, 85% said, if I get to senior high school, I can become a teacher, I can become a nurse. We don't see that happen at all. So they massively overestimate the returns in terms of getting like a stable government job. And so that's the context where if you actually told them, well, hold on, you know, the labor returns are not as high, I think, you know, that may actually deter investments in education, even though we see these outcomes on other things like health and reproductive health, you know, that are very important. So that's just one word of caution. When sharing information about the returns, we want to be very careful about all the domains and not just necessarily focus on one, you know, the labor market one, which is the one that's most top of mind often. This is earnings. On earnings, you know, we didn't see much for quite a while. Lately, we're starting to see, in particular, during the COVID pandemic in 2020, we found that the girls who had gotten a scholarship were able to have more stable income. That's because they are more likely to be wage employed versus self-employed, and so their income was less shocked by the economic shock created by the pandemic. And in 2022, we see still about a 10% gap in their earnings. You know, so when for men, it's not much there. For men, we, on the whole, have been skipping most of the results on the men because we don't see that much going on for the men. We see a lot going on for the women. So back to the policy debate. You know, as I said, in September 2017, free senior high school was launched in Ghana. So now we had been collecting this data for a while, sharing them with the Ministry of Education, the Ghana Higher Education Services, for every year. And then at, the party that was pro free SHS won and then passed free SHS. And the government of Ghana estimates that the policy led 90,000 additional children to enroll right away. But the thing that the debate goes on, because the opposition is still asking, where is the money coming from? It's a lot of money, okay? And so, you know, for us, it seems pretty clear that subsidizing girls has very high immediate returns. I've shown you that in the graph. For boys, it's much less clear. So for a government who would like to subsidize education, you know, but may wonder where the money could come from, focusing on the girls maybe. But what I want to show next is the intergenerational impact that we have, okay? So in this spin-off study, we look at the results on offspring, which are the children of those who got the scholarship or not. And there are many different channels through which this scholarship to adolescents could affect offspring health and cognitive development. First of all, I showed you there was a delay in when people are maybe more older when they have children, and a few of them are able to allocate more resources for each child. Maybe, you know, they have increased health knowledge, their parenting skills, maybe they value education more, maybe they have a higher bargaining power within their household, and, you know, they seem to have higher, less volatile income, okay? So the main result that I want to show today, which, you know, is very striking, is that we find actually child mortality. So the who won the scholarship are less likely to have a child who has died, you know, within the first 3 years, within the first 1 year, and so this is actually a very striking result. We have, you know, this is only 2,000 in our sample. If we look at women, it's only about 1,000, and it's very hard to see, you know, mortality effects. Fortunately, mortality is a rare enough outcome. We do see effects here, which are close to significant. So this is actually a very, very striking. That on its own can reduce child mortality by you know, providing more education to girls. That's like a huge win. And then we also look at the cognitive development of these children. So we go out there and measure through like state-of-the-art tests that we've been developing with Liz Lab, a professor of child psychology at Harvard. And we find that initially at early ages, when we test kids at 1 year old or 3 years old, we don't see any difference between the groups. If the kids get older, 5 years old, 7 years old, we start seeing a gap emerge. And so these are the children of the female scholarship recipients do much better on this test. The magnitudes are quite large. Obviously, we have not that many observations, so the confidence intervals are large as well. But we see significant gaps in learning. Okay, so you know, to up. I lost track of how I'm doing on time, but we scholarship program. Before education was free for everybody, so we were able to create significant contrast between the treatment and comparison group and their achievement rates. The scholarship increased against school completion rates by 30 percentage points for both boys and girls, but since girls are at a disadvantage to start, it's actually a bigger percent change for girls. And we find significant increases in cognitive scores, important delays in fertility and marriage, healthier behaviors, and most importantly, the treatment effects for women are greater than for men in all dimensions. And I didn't go into details because of the time, but we find that marginal girls, and what is called by marginal girls, they are the girls who are induced to attend school by the free education. They are as successful as informational girls. They are the girls who would have gone anyway. And this is very important because it's not true for boys at all. So what this means is the scholarship enables girls to go to school who can be highly successful, girls who actually, have what it takes to do school and to go even beyond senior high school. And the fact that they were not sent to school by their parents receive other lack of support for girls' education, whereas the boys who were not able to go to school because their parents were not paying for them, it turned out that when we paid for them, they didn't do that great, which suggests that the parents are already kind of like, okay, this one, the return prediction for that one may not be that great, okay? So the fact that for these boys that we induce to go to school more with the scholarship, we don't see much going on. For boys, it's almost like, okay, people make the right call of who should go to school and who should not. For girls, clearly, there is a pool of talented girls who don't get that opportunity. And when they get that opportunity through scholarships, they thrive, okay? Now, on top of that, we see these early results from the Oxford study. I'm hoping we can, get those results out soon, are suggestive of very important intergenerational on both health and cognitive development. And so illustrate the promise of investing in girls' education for human capital development on the continent and beyond. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you for presenting this fantastic paper, very important research that really demonstrates concretely the value of investing in girls' education. Super important. Thank you. So now I would like to kick off our panel discussion, and now turn to the practitioners on our panel to tell us what they believe, what they see on the ground in terms of some of the key challenges girls face, and also feel free to reflect on what Nicole and Pascaline have presented, of course. So perhaps Shiraz, I can turn to you first and give you the floor to tell us about what you think are some of the key challenges that girls in particular are facing.
Thank you so much, and let me thank JPAL and Population Council for convening us and inviting UNICEF to be part of this. I'm Shiraz, and I work at UNICEF's headquarters, focusing on gender equality and girls' education. I was rapidly scribbling my notes because I feel like Nicole and Pascaline have answered that question really well and given us such incredible insights about the importance of focusing on girls in education, of the value of it, of the complexity of it, of how education in different ways disproportionately disadvantaged, and girls are disproportionately disadvantaged in different ways through the education system. So I don't actually want to go through that. So what I want to do just in the couple of minutes that I have to kick off this panel is do two things. One is say, maybe almost make a kind of bit of an advocacy case of why there's a sustained focus on girls' education is important. And then I'm just going to give a couple of reflections from, I'm based in UNICEF's headquarters now, but I recently moved from Eastern and Southern Africa, so a couple of reflections from there. So I think there are kind of four main dimensions that we need to think about when we talk about girls' education and why there should be a sustained focus on girls' education. And I'm going to be repeating, and in fact, maybe drawing from Nicole and Pascaline and others when I talk about this. I think first is the rights argument. And what are we talking about there? We're talking about the fact that we're talking about girls and women's empowerment and their broader rights when we talk about girls' education. And I think that's hugely important. And it's linked to need, right? And Nicole talked about those needs, Pascaline did as well. I think there's 4 things maybe to pick out that's particularly important when we think about what's the need in relation to girls' education. One, I think we need to recognize that there's resistance in many quarters to fully promoting girls' and women's rights, and that exists through education policy and education systems. One of the great examples of that, of course, is how fully are we embedding things like comprehensive sexuality education in education systems. A second point is how resilient are our changes. We know that, we talk about kind of these 3 C's, COVID, conflict, climate. To what degree, when those crises hit, are girls disproportionately disadvantaged when it comes to return to education? A third is, I think this was mentioned by Pascaline, about NEET data, not in employment, education and training. We know that girls are twice as likely than boys, even having gone through education, to be NEETs. And lastly, I think in a very key point in our current context of kind of global digital transformation is that we know that girls and women are much less likely to be owning of mobile phones. I think women are 7% less likely to own a mobile phone, 15% less likely to use mobile internet. And actually UNICEF is going to be publishing some more work on this recently. So that's the first point, the rights argument, and that there's still a need to really focus on this. The second point is focusing on girls' education is proactable. When you get systems to focus on marginalized girls, you are getting systems and practitioners at the local level and at the school level to think in a detailed way about barriers, complex barriers, and those multiple barriers that particularly marginalized girls face. And that has a knock-on effect in relation to all those who are disadvantaged. That's the second point. The third point is the return on investment point, and that's obviously to individuals themselves. Pascaline herself just talked about how girls thrive when given the opportunity. We heard, actually, for those of you who've been engaging throughout the test week, about how, for example, when you get girls having 12 years of education, HIV rates reduced by 50%. It's a huge impact. And of course, there's a massive benefit to the economy. And we had our major session on Monday, the World Bank, Mary Pangetsu, talking about, girls is still one of the highest return development investments. And lastly, girls is transformative. Focusing on girls' education can be transformative. We're very engaged as UNICEF with partners to ensure all our work is gender transformative, which is about making sure that education not only is open and accessible and successful for all children, but also is used powerfully to transform societies. And when we focus on girls' education, we listen, we engage, and we ensure that we can build resilience through communities in reforming societies. And very, very quickly, what are some of the experiences? When we focus on girls' education, what can we see? And girls' and women's rights more broadly. We can see examples, for example, experiences that I've seen in northern Uganda, where a real focus on girls' education was able to have a real focus on violence, particularly for girls traveling to and from schools. That has a knock-on effect for everyone. I saw work in northern Kenya, where really focusing on working with communities on the value of education, of girls' education, and seeing that knock-on effect on how programs became more responsive for everyone. We've seen, say, for example, in Rwanda, where there was a whole political system approach to girls' and women's rights. And you see everything from the kind of political change in terms of parliamentary representation of women down to girls and women being involved in education, getting success out of education, and ensuring that success translates into their wider lives. Those are some initial thoughts from me. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Great. Thank you, Shiraz. So Marta, now I would like to give the floor to you. And if you could please share your views with us, and in particular, reflect on what you found most compelling from what Nicole and Pascaline have presented, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Salim, again. And good evening from Nairobi. My name is Martha, and I'm the Executive Director of FAWE. And FAWE is a Pan-African organization. We are in 33 countries across the African continent. And therefore, what I'm going to share is the reflection of the works that we have done across the 33 countries. One of it is, it's very correct that it's important to focus on girls' education. And this is basically in reference to the challenges that girls face in terms of access, in terms of retention, completion, performance, and transition to the world of work. And one of the, what I would point out as the key barriers to girls' education, which has been mentioned by Nicole, and Shiraz has also mentioned the same, but I would just emphasize some of the points now that I'm coming after them. But one of the great issue are the sociocultural issues. And just to mention one is what I would call the value system. And this is related to the economics, the income levels of families. In situations where the families are hardly hit and they are not able to send everybody to school, definitely the boy gets the first chance. And that is in its own becomes a barrier to education for the girls. The other issues are the negative cultural practices. And these negative cultural practices, just to mention one or two, one is the FGM. In cultures that practice FGM, the moment a girl has undergone through that ritual, it clearly indicates that she is fit for marriage. And in most cases, these girls are forced into marriage. And once they get into marriage, definitely their chances of going back to school get very, very limited. And this also is coupled with the gender-based violence, and particularly referring to the issue of school-related gender-based violence. A school is supposed to be the safe place for the child. But from our work, in terms of what we have been implementing, what we have been advocating for is creating a conducive environment for children. Let the school be a conducive environment. Issues of school-related gender-based violence are very indicative of barriers to girls' education. The other issue is the adolescent sexual reproductive health issues, the growing up, management of menstruation. All those are barriers. In situations where girls don't have access to menstrual hygiene kits and how they're able to control, it also becomes a barrier. In situations where teachers are not supportive, where the teaching is not gender responsive, where the teachers are not responsive to the needs of the girls, needs of the boys, you find that it becomes a very big challenge. Even those that have been able to join school, they'll be forced to drop out of school, and that in a way becomes a challenge. The other issue that I can mention is about policy implementation. We have very good policies that would really be creating space for the girls to get into education, but the implementation is a challenge. Enforcement of those policies becomes a very big issue. And if you ask me of what we need to focus on if we are to have girls keep in school, and this also I give based on the work that we have done as FAWE. And one of them, I want to say, when we talk about access, I think access is not a very, very big issue, but equity, looking at they are all accessing education. But as they access education, there are those that join schools that have very good quality. And then there are those that join schools that quality is really compromised. So it becomes challenge. I mean, it becomes a challenge in that it is not equitable access. We also have the girls that are dropping out of school because of unwanted pregnancies, because of child marriage. And if we are to focus on having these girls get back into school, we shall be saving many of them that will otherwise not have a chance. I just want to cite some of the examples we've done. Those girls that have dropped out, they may not be able to go back to the mainstream academic process, but they're able to get skills. They join TVET. We've done good work in Zanzibar, in Mali, with support from some of our partners, particularly NORAD. We are facing challenges that when the opportunity is given to the girls to go to school, the environment is not leveled. So we are working on the policy issue, and this is something that all stakeholders need to focus on, the re-entry policy, giving those girls a second chance to get back into school so that they are able to. And in some of the countries, we realize the policy is there for the girls to get into school, but the environment in the schools is not conducive. And this becomes a point of reference, a point of focus on which many of the stakeholders need to put a lot of effort in to say that as we tell the girls to go back to school, the environment is conducive, the ground is leveled, and they're able to get back and complete their education cycle. The other issue that would be a focus for many of us as stakeholders into the education field is ensuring that's not getting into school, completing the education, but there must be an effort in transition to the world of work, because many girls get into, they gain the education, but when it comes to working, the transition rates are also very, very, very low. And lastly, if we are to make success or to realize the success that we are planning for the girls in education, it's about partnerships and collaboration. Strong partnerships. There is no single organization that can be able to resolve the issues that are stopping girls from getting into school or keeping into school. So it calls for all of us partners, because each institution has a niche that they would want to bring on the table. And if we all work as partners, we have different strengths, we have different weaknesses, but if we treasure partnerships and collaboration, then we shall be able to support the girls to get into school and also be able to break the barriers there that are stopping the girls from getting into school. Allow me to stop at that for now, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Marta. Thank you for those very insightful insights. And Susanna, now I'd like to give the floor to you. And in particular, I know that you've written a very interesting blog for the summit, and you've talked about challenges like access to free school meals, violence in schools, pregnancy, and highlighted the lack of evidence in these domains. Could you tell us a bit about that, please, and also share your insights on what we've been hearing today?
Sure, thank you, Salim. And thank you, JPAL, for convening this panel. I thought the presentations by Nicole and Pascaline were fantastic. I'm blown away by the intergenerational effects that Pascaline presented. So these two barriers, school meals and violence in schools, are ones that we know are important in terms of access to schooling. But as Nicole said in her presentation, they're also really important in their own right. I'm pretty sure that none of us here would let our kids go anywhere near schools that let them go hungry or subjected them to violence. So it's really quite a puzzle to me why these two issues don't have sort of greater prominence on the international education policy agenda. In the case of school feeding, it's actually a very well evidenced intervention. It's also simple and scalable, and we know it contributes to better learning outcomes. It keeps children in school, and it promotes the health and fertility of not just the girls who received meals, but as we saw in Pascaline's presentation, the similarly evidence from India suggesting that it improves the nutrition of their own children a whole generation later. And I once visited a school in Liberia where school enrollment had dropped to about 150 students from nearly 400 the year before. And when my colleague and I quizzed the head teacher on why that was, we discovered that the NGO used to provide school meals, but had packed up and left, and so children didn't come anymore. There's also really good evidence that school feeding can make a big difference to girls' education. So Elisabetta Orino and her collaborators evaluated Ghana's national school feeding programme and found it had large and positive effects overall, but that the largest benefits were for girls and for children from poor households. So why I think we can all agree there's no such thing as a silver bullet in education, but if there was, I think it would be school feeding. And then just to touch on school violence, it's indeed a bit trickier. We know it's a big problem. It's clearly very wrong in its own right, but we also know it harms children's potential. It's associated with lower education achievement and reduced adult income. And we know that far too many children are abused in schools. So about 40% of children in sub-Saharan Africa report experiencing corporal punishment in the last week, including in countries where it's illegal, and 12% of children in Senegal in PISA surveys reported sexual harassment by their teachers in the last 4 weeks. The problem is that data on school violence is pretty patchy and inconsistent. And as, again, Nicole alluded to in her presentation, we have far too few interventions that have been rigorously evaluated, so we don't have a good sense of what works to prevent violence in schools, with a few notable exceptions. You saw in Nicole's presentation that they found no studies on gender-based violence. So I think to move the needle on this barrier, we really need better data and better evidence on what works. And we at CGD want to really try to advance the research agenda there with partners and collaborators. Just one very quick last point. I've been a big fan of the work in Ghana that Pascaline presented for a long time. And, those intergenerational effects, as I said, were really incredible. I think if we really care about reaching the global goals in education, then we need education policies that can scale. And perhaps the most obvious, proven, scalable education intervention is indeed the expansion of free schooling. So I think letting all the kids go to school for free and focusing on the benefits of expanding free schooling is absolutely the right thing to do. Of course, it costs money to reimburse schools for lost fee income and to build new schools in new areas. It's not cheap to do that, but it can pay for itself through higher earnings and tax revenues in the long term. I think I'd also argue against the equity argument that perhaps expanding secondary schooling is benefiting kids who already go to secondary school, but it also allows children from lower income households, and especially girls, to enroll for the first time. So let's let all the kids go to school, stop them being abused, and feed all the children.
Thank you so much, Susanna, and thanks in particular for highlighting the lack of evidence and the need for evidence on some key topics, such as the role of violence and corporal punishment in schools. And now I would like to turn towards where we think we can really make some impact, and in particular the role of evidence and how it can inform policy. So Banta, I will leave the floor to you now, and if you could please tell us a bit about how you help governments measure the results of their policies to support girls' education, and what you think every government should be doing in this respect.
Thank you, Salim, for this opportunity. As we all know, all governments really like to get good evidence, good in quotes. And I think that credible evidence is very important when we transition into elements of policy. And so I would say that in this country, what I've seen going on is that many policymakers will say they need the evidence, they need the credible evidence, and therefore, where are all the people working in the area of girls' education? Where are those people who are programming? Where are the implementers? And therefore, the policy makers are always encouraging us to be able to say, let's have a collective policy engagement arena. The reason they actually claim that is because they don't want to have this piecemeal evidence today, another piecemeal evidence tomorrow, and perhaps the two pieces are not speaking to each other, but rather have a forum where you can actually all share your evidence, and therefore they get a chance to be able to pick what is really relevant in terms of girls' education. And so in that, there's also been a move towards having all implementers of education and all people working in education to also come together and develop what they are calling common indicators, so that if you're talking about enrollment, if you're talking about transition, if you're talking about retention, then you're actually talking about the same thing. And one thing that I've seen work is when we involve these policymakers right from the beginning of these programs and say, we are going to attempt to co-create some of these solutions together with the policymakers, so that right from the beginning, they are able to really internalize what all the program people are talking about and what evidence is being generated across the spectrum. Now, the reason why that co-creation works is that right from the beginning, then the policymakers are able to share their challenges and their struggles in terms of what they're struggling with, measuring some of what works, as we would want to call it in the evidence arena. But then when they start from the beginning, then they realize that you can actually work with them and mainstream some of those solutions into what becomes to be what they can actually take up as policies. Now, so that calls for what we think about sustained policy engagement, and how do we collectively get everybody who is working in the education sector, and particularly on girls' education, to say, this is how we are going to work together to sustain the talking, the discussions between those who are generating the evidence and those who are using the evidence to drive policy. One thing that has worked in Kenya lately is there has been a very consistent and persistent effort to have an education evidence for action. That means that when you are generating evidence, then you have started with the policy question in mind, and therefore that policy question drives the agenda in terms of the evidence, and the policymakers are on the floor really partaking of that evidence and then working together with the evidence generators and the implementers of interventions to be able to help really move that evidence to have traction with policy. So those policy discussions are very important, and the policymakers have been able to appreciate when the research really actually gets traction with evidence, and not that we are in one corner generating our evidence that is supposed to drive the agenda on girls' education on one end, and they are left on the other end, and perhaps they listen to that evidence at the far end of the channel. But I think they want to really get involved and be able to understand what it is that the problem we are trying to solve as researchers and as program people, and therefore use that to be able to move the agenda forward. Thanks, Salim. I would want to stop there for now.
Thank you, Banta. Thank you for raising those valuable points. So Megan, now I will leave the floor to you. And if you could please tell us a bit about your experiences in Educate, and in particular about how you've been successfully incorporating learning into the very core of your activities. We'd love to hear about that, please.
Great, thank you, Salim, and a huge thanks to JPAL and Pop Council for organizing. We're really honored to be working among these impressive organizations and panelists to move the needle on girls' education. Before I dive into what we think implementers can do, I want to share a little bit about Educate. At Educate, we deliver a core experience that helps youth develop the critical, transferable, or soft skills we see as building blocks for success in life after school. And youth build these skills through various hands-on learning activities. Our model has been rigorously evaluated through multiple randomized evaluations with researchers from UC Berkeley, Oregon State University, University of Toronto, and Innovations for Poverty Action. And these evaluations have specifically demonstrated that Educate's model impacts gender equity related outcomes in the long term, including increasing educational attainment, helping young women exercise more control over when they start a family, reducing intimate partner violence, and improving gender norms. And as implementers, we think we can do a few things. All of these are really about orienting ourselves towards evidence-based innovation and really integrating that into the ethos of what you do. So the first thing that we've done at Educate is that we've embedded evaluation and data collection into our program design, implementation, and scale process. So part of this is ensuring that we're tracking outcomes and pathways or mechanisms for impact, not just delivery when we're looking at monitoring our programs. The second thing is that at Educate, we've gone one step further and really embedded qualitative and quantitative research into our program development and scale processes to ensure that we're getting rapid feedback on not only how the program's being delivered, but on things like engagement and early outcomes. We've taken some lessons from tech product development and organize our early program development in sprints where we aim to answer big questions quickly. And that also allows us to get a lot of very useful data on participants. For example, during COVID school closures, when we needed to develop a way to reach youth while schools were closed, in our context, the main way to do this was through standard mobile phones. And we took great care to dive into the barriers to phone access and how those barriers varied by gender, which Shiraz mentioned earlier, to ensure that the program we were developing wasn't going to exacerbate existing inequalities. And then as products mature, we submit them to more rigorous tests through our rapid impact assessment system. And programs must demonstrate positive results in order to move to the next level of scale. The second thing that we as implementers can do is really think deeply about gender differences and how the gaps change over time as a result of your program. So embedding evaluation into your program gives you a great deal of data. And when you have that data, obviously you need to disaggregate it by gender. But we need to not just look at averages, as Pascaline touched upon in her presentation, but look at how the gender gap is influenced by the program. It's not enough just to improve outcomes for girls, but we need to help girls make up the ground. Also disaggregating by other youth characteristics that might influence barriers to education. If you don't break down that data, you miss a lot of lessons about how to help different types of young women. And one size is unlikely to fit all in terms of programming, and breaking down the data helps us figure out how to both target and tailor interventions. And finally, I think implementers need to think deeply about how to innovate for all girls and how we can take evidence that's coming out of the world of rigorous research and figure out how to integrate that into what the field is, or integrate what the field is learning into what we're doing. So an example of this is while working through traditional education system provides a clear pathway to move the needle on gender equity for girls who are in that formal education system, to truly impact girls' lives, we also need to talk about what we can do for young women and girls who are unable to access traditional education, who couldn't overcome some of those barriers that Nicole laid out before. Those who didn't make it all the way through secondary school for a variety of reasons. And to address this problem, Educate's now building boot camps for out-of-school youth, a condensed and accessible version of our core experience modeled off another rigorously evaluated packaging of this model. So around the time we launched the RCT of our in-school program, Educate collaborated with researchers from UC Berkeley to support the implementation of SEED, a 3-week intensive boot camp for secondary graduates. And when we followed up 4 years later, when the researchers followed up 4 years later, we saw that youth who participated in this boot camp were earning about 30% more than their peers in the comparison group, which is, in our minds, pretty impressive. So that got us thinking, how can we scale this up and integrate what we learned through SEED into our existing programs? And could a condensed version of our core experience or of this boot camp work for the out-of-school population? So we're currently working to adapt this highly effective program for rural girls and young women. And to us, that's what's really going to move the needle and enable success by 2030. It's meaning that we have proven models that provide all young women with the skills to achieve their goals. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Megan. So before we start the Q&A section, Shiraz, I want to come back to you. And I know that tomorrow there's a big event that you guys at UNICEF are organizing to encourage governments to be more accountable towards girls. Can you tell us a bit about this event and what you hope to get out of it?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to say a couple of words about this. So we are with partners. UNICEF is looking to launch a global platform that acts as an accountability mechanism for holding governments and partners to account on their commitments on gender equality and girls' education. It's a very simple idea. It's coming out of the Transforming Education Summit on Monday. A call to action specifically on gender equality and girls' education was made. 2 heads of state, 2 partners, a radical and quite an ambitious one. As part of that, the call to action noted that there needs to be an accountability to this commitment, but not just our commitment. There have been many commitments, whether it's at the G7, G20, obviously SDG 4, SDG 5, at the Africa Union level, different levels of commitments around girls' education and gender equality. We simply believe, and I think everyone shares this, is that there needs to be a moment where we bring actors together, partners, governments, partners, donors, civil societies, young people, to have a singular focus on asking basically 3 questions. Are we on track with our commitments around girls' education and gender equality in education? Where are the gaps? And maybe looking at that at country by country level. Some of you may have seen that Malala Fund actually published a scorecard for many countries. I'm sure you'll be able to Google that relatively easily, maybe building on something like that. And lastly, very relevant to this conversation, I think, is a question around that we want the platform to ask, is, are our interventions aligned with what we know is going to make the impact around gender equality and girls' education? So that's what we're looking to do. Tomorrow we've got a forum that is going to bring some partners together on that. But I think the key thing for people who are in this meeting, we'd love to hear from you. And I know the JPAL team are putting links in the chat, and we'll put a link related to this platform where you can register your interest or just ask a question. We've got an online form, and we'll put that link in the chat, and we'd love to hear from you so that we can get back to you, because what we're going into tomorrow's meeting is a basic idea of what we think we need as a global platform. But what we want to go through over the rest of the year is work out what exactly should this look like, and so that we can have a first meeting of the platform next year. And yes, the link has just been put into the chat. So thank you very much. Let me stop there.
Great, thank you. Now, before we start the Q&A from the floor, and I again remind all of you to please type any questions you have for our panelists and presenters at the Q&A, if you haven't already done so. But before we start that, I want to ask to all of our panelists and presenters, we've talked about many different challenges and barriers that girls face in accessing education. Do you have in your minds one barrier that you think is key to prioritize, that if you could select one, which one would it be and why? Which barrier do you think the government should work on as soon as possible? Do you have, I know this is a very difficult thing to say, but if you have one, then that would be great to hear. Anyone?
I'm happy to just kick off. I thought, sorry, I see that actually a colleague had their hand up, but just in the interest of time, it's very difficult to answer that, but just to say, I think ending violence could be the one. I think the reason is we know the kind of almost near universal prevalence of violence in schools. But I think if you were to go to most schools around the world and ask the head teacher, ask the teacher, ask the district education officer, do you feel accountable for ending violence in your institution? I think you'd either get a no or a kind of shrug of the shoulders. And I think we need to fundamentally change that.
If I may go, Selim, I think I agree with Shiraz on violence, but I would also add that perhaps the root cause of that would be if we were to change the gender norms in some of the communities around the world, then perhaps that violence would somewhat, we would start really chipping in at the ending violence. The reason I say that is because some of that violence is rooted in the kind of norms and the kind of gender norms that exist. And those norms have been instituted, they have been acculturated by certain practices. And I think one of us also mentioned the aspect of cultural practices. If you have cultural practices and norms that really institute some of the practices within communities, then they end up that either the girls and eventually the women would really suffer the violence. And that is the reason why even in some of the schools, the men who are the teachers or the head teachers may not be able to end the violence because sometimes the school cannot work in isolation. And therefore, you need the combined effort of, community leaders, religious leaders, and then, of course, supporting the schools to be able to say, right, we are about and able to end the norms, the negative norms in our communities, and therefore, those that perpetuate violence then can be able to stop. But otherwise, then you'll find that, as Shiraz says, you go to schools and of course the head teacher cannot be able to be accountable and say that violence will end, simply because the schools are situated within communities and within those norms and cultures that we experience every day. Thank you.
Yeah, I can pick it up from there. And again, thank you. If you asked one, of course, it's very tricky, but I would go with the re-entry. We all had the experience of COVID, and we all appreciate how many girls became pregnant and how many girls are out of school and many more that are at the verge of getting out of school. My focus would be into creating a policy that gives the girls a second chance. And not only the policy, but also creating an environment in the school that motivates and encourages the girls to get into school and keep into the school and complete the education cycle. Thank you.
Thanks, Martha. Any other thoughts from our panelists?
I'm happy to jump in, and I agree that violence is the major barrier that we need to be tackling for girls. My toddler started nursery school at a state primary school near me here in London. And when I went to meet the head teacher last term before he started, he said, my first priority as head teacher is to make sure that your children are safe. I think that's what every parent wants. And I think it's important that schools in every country cannot be seen as good schools unless they can keep children safe. And that means every teacher and every head teacher needs to believe it's their job to do that. If I had one more thing that I wish the girls' education community would care a bit more about, it's jobs. I think we can see that where there are jobs for girls and women to go on to after they leave school, they stay in school for longer. So thinking about those links between the education system and the wider system is also important.
Thank you, Susanna. Pascaline, you were, I think, saying something.
I agree with everyone's point, which actually speaks to what I wanted to say, which is that I think the question of is there one barrier, like one thing, I think it's probably ill-posed, because every context is going to have its own challenges. I think it's important to recognize heterogeneity across contexts and also across time. So the point that, after COVID, there's like a specific issue that girls have maybe, started a family, and then it's much harder to go back to school in a context where that's not, supported. That's also speak to that. So we always hope that there are some silver bullets out there that we can just say, this is the one thing you have to do. But I think being cognizant of the fact that context is at its own challenge, it also helps us thinking to the point that Benta raised earlier about, co-creation with the policymakers. And if we, acknowledge given context, it also makes it easier to start these partnerships with the policymakers, like coming to meet them, where they see the most pressing issues at play in that context.
Nicole?
Yeah, I agree with what everybody said, and I can't pick one. But partially, Pascaline said it very well, that I think looking closely and at any specific context and identifying what the unique dynamics are in that setting will help answer that question better. But there shouldn't be economic barriers to schools for girls. That I think is another one I'd put up on the top of the list here with what everybody else said as well. I'd add that.
That's right. Thank you. Megan, did you want to add anything?
Oh, I would just echo, what everyone has shared. I think so much of what Educate tries to do is tie education to life outcomes and make it relevant for life after school, which seems to be particularly important for young women, not only in improving those outcomes, but in helping them sort of carve out the space and the agency to pursue the goals, whatever their own goals, whatever they might be. So I think I'd like to underscore, I think, Susanna's point about tying it to sort of that broader system.
Thank you, Megan. So one of the questions that came up also in the Q&A from our participants was about gender norms. And I think we've already mentioned this a few times, but perhaps we could just, before we finish up today's panel, come back to that point and discuss what we know about their impact on education, and also what do we still need to learn. So if you have any views on that, please feel free to unmute yourself and share your views. Well, maybe I can get us started. So I know, Marta, I believe you mentioned during your discussion that FGC, for example, plays a big role in countries where it's prevalent in terms of access to girls' education. And I think that's a very important topic where we need much more evidence that we don't really know a lot about. And that's one example of one type of cultural practice or harmful norm that we know definitely affects, but where we need more rigorous evidence, I would say.
Thank you, Salim. I know we've mentioned it. There are many cultural practices that may not be friendly or that may be harmful to the girls. And one of what I mentioned is the FGM, that's the female genital mutilation. It definitely affects. The other that I could mention, the gender norm, is in terms of the early or forced marriages. That is a very big barrier to girls' education, because once they are forced into marriage, I know many countries have the age of consent at 18, but there are countries where they also have to marry off the girls as early as 12. And that definitely, it's a social practice that also infringes on the rights of the girls. So those early marriages, forced marriages, definitely are something that many of us do reckon with. It affects the education of the girls. Yeah.
Yes, Nicole.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Martha. I also think that the issue with, one of the issues with gender norms, we could talk about this all day, is there are things that are overt and school-related gender-based violence, but there's also things that are so insidious and woven so tightly into the fabric of a child's education experience, whether it's, and other people have talked about this at tests, what the content of the curricula, there's no photos of, women, if they even have a book, it's how girls are steered from, I think sometimes even unknowingly, towards, away from math and science because, of stereotypes. I think, even mild harassment every day over and over and over and over and over is toxic, and it harms all children, and it's particularly, toxic for girls. And I think sort of helping, figuring out how to sort of realign that in schools and education systems it will take, as people have said here, a real, strong partnerships and, communication and collaboration. But it's so important. Thank you.
If I could jump in, I think I definitely agree with what Martha and Nicole shared. To add, I think when Educate thinks about shifting gender norms, and when we've kind of dug into some of the long-term data, we see that it's not only important to shift in what girls see themselves as capable of or what they see as realistic to attain after school, but you also have to think about how their peers, the boys in the classroom, see what girls can achieve, what role they can and should play in household decisions, in society, in the economy, and thinking about how to integrate that into the curriculum. And so a lot of what we do is try to think really deeply about what are the examples that we're providing when we're illustrating aspects of the curriculum, and how does that both go from the very, very local scale of like, this is someone who looks like me in my community, all the way up to an example like Malala of young women who take part in broader conversations and go on after school, stay in school and achieve various things on economics, on in politics and things, and providing them with clear examples, not just for the young women, but for young men as well.
Okay, thank you so much to all our panelists and participants for sharing your views. It's really been a great panel and a pleasure to be part of it. Thank you so much. And I'm taking away 3 key lessons from today. First of all, we have very valuable and rigorous evidence already emerging from studies like Pascaline's study in Ghana that demonstrate the importance of scholarships, and other studies that have shown the impact that school meals or improving access to school by reducing distance to school can have in terms of improving girls' enrollment and retention rates in school. But we've also touched upon many important barriers where we know from the field that they exist, but we need more rigorous evidence. And as in JPAL, we are trying our best to fill in these gaps, but we definitely have much more work to do. In particular, we discussed issues such as teenage pregnancies or gender-based violence in schools and restrictive gender norms such as FGM, where we need much more rigorous evidence, and we certainly have work to do to fill those gaps. And finally, I'm really very thrilled and happy to see that we have such a great community and many people working on this important issue, and many people are interested in hearing our views. So it's been really great to see that, and I hope that we can build on this, build on the linkages that we've created today. And if any of you have any views about how we can do that better, or any feedback about what we have done today and how we could have done it better and how we could have improved that, please feel free to share it with us via email or Twitter or LinkedIn after the event. We are really looking forward to hearing all your thoughts and comments and feedback about that. And thank you all for attending. It's been really wonderful to spend the last few hours with you. And I hope you enjoy the rest of today and we keep in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.